My name is Thorsten Overgaard. I'm a Danish photographer. I travel the world taking photographs and teaching photography. Today I will give you the one thing you need to know about photography. Below the video here there is a free download. You can download my ebook about some of the famous photographers and their photographs, how they took them, why they took them, and also I tell something about why I photograph and how I do it. It's a free book and it's a kick of inspiration, so you can pause the video, click on the link now, and then you have it. You can read it after the video. What happens for most people is that they get very enthusiastic about photography. Maybe you use your iPhone, or somebody has a camera that you see them use, or maybe you try to use it, and then you get very enthusiastic. You want to take photographs. And what often happens, and I'm telling this just to not make you wrong, is that you get a camera and about maybe 70% of the pictures you take are okay, but 30% is not that okay. There's something wrong with the light, the focus, or something. It doesn't turn out the way you want. And I can also say that the more artistic type of photography you want to do, the kind of harder it gets. But don't worry about it. That's what this video about, is how to make it easy. But usually you can say 70% of the pictures are great and 30% is not that great. And a normal solution is that you go on a website or you go somewhere and you look for a bigger camera, a more expensive camera, a more advanced camera, or if you have a Canon 5D Mark 8, then you wait for Mark 9 because that must be better. But basically what happens is you get the Mark 9 or the next model and you still have the same problem. That's 30% of what you do doesn't really work. So that was not the solution, and this is where I come in. I will tell you what the solution is. You don't have to go 4 or 5 years in a school to learn to take photographs. It's actually very simple. It is as simple as this. The word photography basically comes from writing with light. That is what the word photography means. You could also say painting with light. That make more sense. So you can paint with paint like the painters did, or you buy a camera and then now you can paint with light. It's much faster and easier, and it doesn't cost as much, and it doesn't fill up as much space as paintings. So light is of essence of photography. It shouldn't be a big surprise. Yet you go buy a camera and it have 250 buttons and menu choices you can make. But why does it have all that when it's just about the light? And let me explain, because when you can control light, you can control a camera. And how does it work? Well, let's take a good old school camera like this, because here it's very simple to see what it is. So there is 3 controls to control the light on a camera to get the light right. So what do I mean with the right light? Well, the thing is that when you look at me, my skin looks like it's supposed to be. If it was underexposed, if there's too little light, it doesn't look right. If there's too much light, it doesn't look right. So there is one correct exposure, and that is the correct light where things look in the camera or on your film, on your computer screen, like what you looked at. And it doesn't matter if it's mountains or faces or whatever it is, that is the correct exposure. And that's where the camera comes in, that it has controls, very few controls to get the light right. So here I have a camera. Essentially a camera is a dark room you carry around. It's a dark box, because inside the camera you have either a sensor or film which is light sensitive. And it's the same if you take an iPhone here, there's a sensor in here behind the lens, and that is light sensitive. That's how you make photographs. Photograph is not something that you make digitally or somehow it makes lines or it collects the things from. No, it's just what you photograph is reflections of light. And that means when you can see that when you look at a person or a wall or a tree, the shape of that tree, the colors and everything is light reflected. You're not actually looking at the light source, because let's say the light source is the sun. So the sun comes down, it hits the tree, and the reflection of light that you see is what defines the tree. It defines the clarity, the sharpness of it, the shape of things and everything. So that's basically how simple it is with light. So then you have the camera that records the light, and the three controls you have on the camera to make sure that you get the correct exposure, that it's not too bright and not too dark, is these three. So if we take the first thing, is here we have something I call an aperture, and it's when I turn this ring, you can hardly see it, but aperture basically means a hole through, and it's as simple as this. I'll show you here, because I can open this camera. There we go. And this is an old film camera, so this is great for this demonstration. So what you have here is, you can see here if a curtain, it's called a shutter, and behind this there would be a sensor, or in this case there would be film. So this is like, in case you're so young, you've never seen a film, it's like this. And this is simply just plastic with light sensitive material on, so this is light sensitive. So you put in the film here, and let's see if I can do it more properly so you can get an idea. So the film would be here, and you take a photo, and then you roll the film to the next frame, and then you take another picture and the next frame. And all this happens while the film is in the dark in here. So the way the light comes on to the film is that the shutter curtain goes up, and here I set it so you can see it stays up. And then you can see here through this, you can see the aperture, what it does. So the aperture is simply just pieces of metal that makes the hole smaller and smaller. And the numbers here on the lens basically means that every time you go from one number to the next one, you reduce the light to half. And then you go again, reduce the light to half. And that's how you can go from 100% light down to usually 2% light by using the aperture on the lens. The aperture on a lens, apart from reducing the light, it also changes the depth of field. So if you've seen that you go and take your iPhone photos and everything is in focus, and that looks great, then you see somebody who has a real camera and they take a portrait and the background is out of focus, and you wonder what kind of camera do you have, how do you do that? And that is because you have a camera here with a big negative, a big sensor, and you have a wide open aperture. And the thing is that the aperture narrows the focus. So when the hole is wide open, the focus is maybe like this. So you focus on my eyes, and then my eyes are going to be in focus, and my ears is going to start be out of focus, and the background is going to be out of focus. The moment you stop down here to reduce the light, then you sharpen the background and the foreground. So the depth of field, the depth of focus becomes wider, a bigger zone. And then you get the iPhone look. Now everything is in focus, and you cannot really, you can say that's an artistic tool that you can select selective focus, that you focus on the eyes of one person, and then the rest of the people in the photo or the garden or the houses, whatever is there, is slightly out of focus. And that isolates that person and make it look very aesthetic and very artistic. And that's what you do with wide open aperture. And the reason I'm saying that is because generally I don't stop down the aperture, I keep the aperture wide open. I like wide open lenses. And I mean, don't be scared. Most of the cameras here are Leica, they're expensive as heck. And it's not to be loved, it's just because they have some of the qualities I like, and that is that they're simple and the lenses are the best in the world. So it's not to be snobby, that's just a fact for me that this is the tool I like. But it's the same for all photography. It doesn't matter if you take an iPhone or you take an expensive camera, it's the same rules, and that's the one I'm telling you now. So this way to reduce the light and get the correct exposure. So let's say it's sunlight, then you have to stop down because there's too much light. But you can do something else instead of this. You can keep it wide open, and then you have here a shutter time, a shutter dial. So here you can change this. So this is 1/25 of a second, and that's actually 1 second divided by 125. It's amazing that you can do this mechanically. Then you can have a curtain goes up for just that short bit, but it gets even worse. This one can go to 2,000 of a second. And again here you could say that when I go from 125th of a second, when I go to 250, I reduce light to half. When I go 500 of a second, I reduce light to half. And this is where it comes in. Maybe you have heard about the exposure triangle, and that is part of it, that you could say each tool on the camera you can reduce light to half, or you can expand it or double the light to the double. And you can say, okay, so already now you can see this pattern that I can go here 1 stop, 2 stop, 3 stop. Now I reduce the light to 12.5%, but I don't want to change my aperture, so I'm not going to do that. So instead I'm going to change my shutter speed dial here. So instead of this exposure, I'm going to go 4-click here. Now I change the shutter speed, and the shutter speed doesn't change the look of the picture. If you take a portrait, you cannot tell if it's taken at 1/60th of a second or 2,000th of a second. But you can definitely tell if it's taken at 1.4 or 2.0 or 5.6, because the whole depth of field changes. So that's a tool I use less. And in older cameras, and this is actually an older camera that I really like, because it's built like a tank, and that's why it's still around. In older cameras like this, when you look through it, you would have an arrow going up and down, and there's a little mark that this is where it should be for the exposure to be correct. And the way you would do in most cameras is that you would change the aperture till that came. And that's simply just because most cameras had an aperture, and somehow that was most natural to use it that way. You set the time, and then you change the aperture till the light is right. I do the opposite. I keep the aperture and I change the shutter speed till the light is right. So those 2 of the ways to control the light. And then we have the third method to control the light, and that is the sensitivity of the sensor. And if we take film here, we start with this because this is what have been used for more than 100 years. You could say digital is fairly new. It's only, you could say, basically 20-25 years since we got the first digital camera, but the principle is the same, that you record light. And here with film, it's simply a piece of plastic, and you have chemistry here that you could say the chemistry here is made like, it's not made like skin, but to give you an idea that you can make sensitive chemicals and less sensitive chemicals, you could take the skin that if you have children in a kindergarten and one is red-haired, he can only be in the sun for 10-20 minutes, then he burns up. You have someone with brown eyes, they can stay out and play all day. So that's different sensitivity. And it's the same you have here in film. This one is twice as sensitive as this one. This is called 100 ISO, 200 ISO. And if we go to digital cameras instead, then suddenly we have ISO, where I'm going to put away the film camera here, and we take a camera like this. And this one actually happens to have the ISO dial on the outside here. So here I can change it from 64 to 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, and then the dial is limited, so I can go in the menu and I can change the ISO. I can go to 50,000, 102,000 ISO, and so on. So you can say in the older days, actually not that long ago, the maximum for most film was like 3,200 ISO, and even there you had lots of grain, like lots of noise, because the chemistry was really, you really put turbo on it, so it gave a different look, which could be beautiful. Today it's no problem to get a sensor in a camera that can do 3,200, 6,400, 12,000 without, and it actually still looks nice. It doesn't have big grains or noise. So this is the third way to control the light. So we have aperture here. Also on this one, you can change the aperture here. You can change the speed of the shutter. And then you have the ISO here, the third one, and it goes the same as the other ones, that you go from 200 to 400 to 800. And ISO simply is just short for International Standard Organization. So basically it doesn't mean anything, it just means that we agree that when something is 100 ISO, it is this sensitive, so you can measure it and you can compare it. But this is the three controls you have. So you can say, okay, if you want to stay wide open here, and this camera can go maximum 4,000 of a second, and I'm in sunshine, then if I shoot here at 200 ISO, it's actually going to be overexposed because I cannot lower the light on this one on the shutter speed, and I cannot really lower it on the aperture without changing the look. Okay, then I can go down in ISO. So I can go down to 64. So now I can actually take a picture in sunshine with a wide open lens at 1.4 or 2.0. And within the shutter speed, and it's going to be correctly exposed. So that's what you work with. That is the limits, and you could say, here we get back to, you could say, that maybe you don't have the right camera. You know, you buy a camera and you think this is awesome, and you've seen the pictures in the brochure and online, and it's amazing. People do landscapes and bird photography and street photography and everything, and it looks fantastic. And then you get the camera and you go on a hike somewhere out in nature, and you get up 4 o'clock in the morning because you want to go see some specific mountain and the sun rises behind them or in between them, and that's your photo. And then you're there and it doesn't work because the camera have all these buttons, but you don't know how to control the light. And that's not necessarily because you're stupid or anything. One of the things is that these cameras I showed you so far have an aperture ring here. You can change the aperture here, and you can see what it is. I can see, oh, here's 2.0, or if it's 5.6, I can look at my camera, it's 5.6. Let me change it to 2.0. I can see my shutter speed, and I can also see my ISO dial here. Most cameras doesn't have that. And that doesn't really make sense. You could say, if photography is all about light, why can't you then control the light on the camera? Well, you could say you can. You could say if you take an iPhone here, it definitely doesn't have an ISO dial. It doesn't have any aperture dial or anything. It's just the phone does all for you. And yeah, then you can point it here, and you can point at a highlight on the photo, and then it's going to expose it down. That's what you can do, and you can change it a little bit. But you actually don't control ISO, aperture, or speed. It's all something the camera does. And a lot of cameras does this. Here I found a little bit old school one. And you could say this one is very typical for many digital cameras today. And that is that you have a dial here. We can choose auto, program mode, aperture mode, and so on. And you can go video. And then you look, where can I change my shutter speed? Well, you have to go inside the menu. And then you have to use a dial here to go up and down. Aperture ring, no, it doesn't have an aperture ring, so you can't change the aperture. And ISO sits in the camera, which is kind of okay, you could say, compared to in the old days, you would have to go take out your 200 ISO film, and then you want to photograph at night, you have to put in a 3200. So that's a little bit, that's some work. So in the same way, you could say any camera today, you basically have to go into the menu and change the ISO, and that's fine. But a camera, you could say, basically should have the ability to control the light easily. Another one I have here, well, just if I will show you here. So this is also an old school one. This is from 2004. This is a great camera. It has a zoom here, or this is actually the focus, and have autofocus, and you can go manual focus on it. And this is called a Leica Diglux 2, and then you can zoom here, and then you have the aperture ring here, and you have the shutter speed dial here, and then you can go into the menu here, and you can change the ISO. This is kind of, yeah, it's 2004, so that's an old camera. Still amazing lens and everything, 5 megapixels and so on. Actually a great camera for many things, especially if you want to start out with something not too expensive. Then you have one here, is a Leica Diglux 7, that's the current model of this camera. This is one that Leica have made together with Panasonic. So it has Leica lens and it has some Leica design to it, but then you turn around, you have the buttons, and a lot of it is, you can say, very Japanese thinking in the way that it's like the more buttons, the more features you can add, the better it is. And that's one of the strange things, that the smaller a camera you use, the more point and shoot camera you use, the ones that you want to buy and just take with you on holiday because you want to take photos not with your phone but with a real camera. But the smaller the camera gets, the more complicated it gets. And it doesn't make any sense, you could say, a complicated camera should be for professionals, you know. The bigger camera, the more complicated, but that's actually not the case. So that's one of the tricks that plays you, that you go buy a camera and they say, this is an awesome camera, it can do everything. And probably it can, but to make it do anything or everything, you have to read the manual and you have to remember what all these buttons does. But the good thing about this camera is that even if it's a small one, you actually have an aperture ring out here. So you can change the aperture, and it also have a shutter speed dial here. And then again, you change the ISO inside the camera. Then there's more modern cameras. And again, sorry that it's all Leica. It doesn't have to be Leica. You just have to look for a camera that is simple, so you can control the light. You don't need to control all kinds of other things. You just basically need to control the light. That's the main thing. That's the thing that's going to frustrate you. You get up 4 o'clock in the morning and you have this great landscape photo. The sun is coming up. You have about 5 minutes to get this shot, and you can't figure out, where do I set the camera? Why is it doing as it's doing? So you have to take control of the camera, and that is done by getting a simple camera. This one is very special because it's kind of like an iPhone. So here you have to go in, and it's touchscreen, and then you can program these buttons up here to do different things. But it's very simple in that way. It has very few choices. And you can say, this is an old lens I put on via an adapter. The lens it comes with, you cannot change the aperture, and it's autofocus and everything. But you can change the lenses to something that have an aperture ring. So in that way, you can see there's many different choices. The one I showed you here is actually a current model. This came out in 2022, and it looks like an old camera. It almost looks like a film camera, and that is the point with it. For me, is that it has very few buttons and choices, and it only has what I need. So you could say, okay, so don't despair. So even if you have a fancy camera, a Canon or whatever, that can do everything, then what you can do is you can tame the camera. You can go in and say, okay, how do I control the light with this camera? Where are the settings? And of course, if you have 250 other choices, you have 10 buttons outside of the camera, you have to read the manual, find out what does these buttons do, and which ones do I want to use, and which settings should I set it to, and leave it on so I don't have to deal with all kinds of stuff that moves around. So that's a little bit of work, but with most cameras, you can actually accomplish that you can just stop them from doing all kinds of fancy stuff and just put you back in control of light. And then when you have pressed and moved around in menus, and you get tired of this, okay, now I'm going to get a camera where I can actually control these things on the outside. Then there's one shortcut that many cameras have these days, and they have like a thumb wheel. Some have a joystick or something, but they have something here. And what this thumb wheel usually does in photography, you could say, in my opinion, it's completely wrong to have this thumb wheel, but I do have them. And even professionals use them a lot, because you could say when they stop having aperture rings on the outside and shutter speed and everything, how are you going to control the camera? And you get to a point where even professional photographers can actually remember how you did things when you had real cameras like this. So what happens with the thumb wheel is that you have your aperture here, and then you have maybe here I have aperture priority, that's the same as automatic, and I set the ISO here to 64. So I take a picture and I think it's too bright, and I can actually change the exposure with my thumb wheel. And on this one, it changes the shutter speed. So that's kind of what I would do myself manually. I'll just change the shutter speed here. On many cameras, the setting of the thumb wheel can be different. So that's something you have to study, that it can actually change the aperture, it can change the ISO, it can change the shutter speed. And sometimes you just turn it and then the camera decides what happens. But then you can change that choice, that no, don't touch my aperture, don't touch my ISO, just change my shutter speed. And many cameras have electronic viewfinders, so you can actually preview the photo and see what is the exposure, how does it look. It looks too bright, I'm going to turn this one a little bit, there it looks, and then you take the picture. So that's great, but you can say, basically my aim for this is to just save you 4 or 5 years of photography education, because all you need to know is that you have to be able to control light. Even it's all very simple. I've written a book about it, and there's a link to it below, and it's called The Freedom of Photographic Expression, and that is truly the Freedom. It also comes as an extension course, so if you want to dive into it, an extension course, you can do that. So let's just say now you know how to control light and you figured out this is how my camera works. It has an aperture, it has an ISO, and it has a shutter speed. So even I can't see it on the outside, it actually does have it, and all cameras have. So it's in the menu. There's a way to control this, and you can totally control it. Okay, so then you think, but what about the rest of photography? I'll tell you two things. One thing is that if you look through the history of photography, the iconic photographs in history, and that's again, there's the link to my book below here that's going to give you a good idea and some examples of it. But those pictures, funny enough, was taken by photographers that didn't know a lot. They were very enthusiastic. They just started out, maybe like you did, that wow, I want a camera, I want to go out and take photographs, and I want to climb the mountains and the valleys, and I want to travel to countries and take photographs, or go to the market on Saturday. So that the enthusiasm, and that is what makes photographs. So you are the one making the photographs, not the camera. That's very basic and very important. But it also tells you that if the big masters made some of the greatest photographs before they knew a lot about photography and didn't have a lot of experience, then that is totally possible. The next thing you will think, well, but there's so many things I should learn in photography. I should read books about composition, and I should know about Leibovitz, and I should read my history, I should know this and that, and there's all those rules of thirds and blah, blah, blah. No, I'll let you in on a secret, and that is, it's covered in, I've done this book, The Composition in Photography, The Photographer as a Storyteller, and there's a link to it below the video. It's not free, but that is an 840-page book about composition. And my aim with that is not to tell you how complicated it is to take photographs, but the aim is to tell you how simple it is. And the secret I'll let you in on is that the most important element in composition is not triangles or lines and rule of thirds, all this BS. That is things that have been invented by people in universities and elsewhere who doesn't take photographs, trying to analyze paintings and photographs. And I also tell in the book why rule of thirds is not relevant. It's not a rule. It's nothing. It's just somebody mentioned at a point for a different reason, and then somehow it was snapped up and everybody talks about it on photo forums that, oh, you have to know your rule of thirds. But that is not the key element. So when people talk about composition, they often think about rule of thirds and some kind of rule, some secret they should know to be able to take good photographs. But here's the simplicity of it. The most important element, surprise, in photography is light. And that is also in composition. And what does it mean? Well, it means if you see something that looks beautiful, you get up in the morning, or you take a walk around sunset where the light is low, you see something that looks really beautiful. And it is. So now it's just almost a matter of just taking your camera and get the exposure right. If it's too bright, it doesn't look right. If it's too dark, it doesn't look right. When you have it right on, then it looks real and it's crisp, and you record the beauty that you saw. And then you can say the framing is what it is. It's something you can figure out. You can recognize something when it looks great, and then now you have to have a tool so you can record it. And my thing I say is, if you can control a light on this one, you can figure it out. That is basically how simple photography is. And then there can be a lot of other things you can look at or get inspired by. And you can say that the most inspiring thing is having a camera that you're familiar with and you like to use, and it's not too chunky. It's something that you can actually carry with you and take with you at all times. And my slogan is always wear a camera, and that means you have the camera with you. You go to the supermarket, you go to a party, you go hang out with friends, you go to school, you have meetings in the bank, whatever, you take a drive somewhere, you have the camera with you. So when you see something that is beautiful or something you think this is interesting, I like this, then you can take your camera, you can control the light, you can take a picture, you can take many to get one right, and that's how you make pictures. And that is basically the simplicity of it. And of course, you get into it, you want to have bigger lenses, bigger cameras, more expensive lenses, and so on. And I mean, that can be okay, but that's actually not going to solve the basic problems. If you cannot control your camera and your exposure, you're going to have the same problem with any camera. So that's how simple it is. It's something even a child can figure out. So of course you can figure it out. And then you can say, okay, yeah, if you want to take photograph birds, then the iPhone is not going to do it because the bird is way over there. So it's like, it's going to be a tiny bird. So maybe you want a 300mm lens that costs $20,000 or whatever. That's fine then, but it's still a matter of, even with a $20,000 lens, it's still a matter of controlling the light. If you don't control the light, it is not going to look like $20,000 lens. So that's the simplicity of it. So grab your camera and look, how does this actually work? How does this apply? Is he full of BS, or is this actually how simple it is? And while you do this, remember to always wear a camera, and thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.